Okay, so Mike Block was here exactly 3 years ago, when COVID was making its way around the world, and he gave a terrific presentation about going to the British Virgin Islands and so forth. So we've asked him back again to tell a different story. So here's Mike.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. It's very nice to be back here. What I'm going to try and do today is just give you a little bit of a talk and a flavor of our experience in 2020-21 during the COVID pandemic. When Gloria and I got laid off from AstraZeneca back in 2012, our long-term future seemed a little uncertain. We knew we wanted to go away on the year on the boat, but we didn't know how it would pan out beyond that. And now looking back 10 years later, we spent time teaching at Framingham State University. We ran a charter sailing business for a little while, a little bit of photography. But the pattern has been live on the boat for 1 year and then be at home for 2 years. And we've done that 3 times now, which has been great. So the first time that we lived on the boat, 2012, we went down the East Coast and we went down to the Bahamas and got down to just around about there, down to Georgetown, and then made our way back. And that was a really fun and exciting trip. The second time in 2017, we took the boat offshore on the Red route from Norfolk down to Tortola. That was about a 10-day passage, and then spent some time down in the Eastern Caribbean, and then worked our way back on the Blue route, back up through the Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas. In 2020, our plan was to go down the coast and then take the Green route, go offshore as quickly as we could to get eastwards, and then follow the trade winds down to the Caribbean. And then potentially the following spring to take the boat back up to Bermuda and then across the Atlantic to Europe. And of course, 2020 was the start of the pandemic as it impacted us, and those plans did not come to pass. However, I should say that we had a great time during that year. I also am conscious that many people didn't. It was a very bad year, a bad couple of years for lots of people, and I don't know what your experiences were. So if I sound insensitive, I don't intend to be, and I realize that the impacts that it had on us were really trivial. So please bear that in mind. So rather than just talk about where we went to and give you a sequence of destinations, I want to try and give you an impression of what it's like to live on the boat for a year. Talk about what we love about it, what's the challenge living on the boat, and maybe what was different during the COVID years. And I'll also show you some pictures of the most memorable places that we went to. So in terms of the sailing, I think we both enjoy sailing, and it can be wonderful. But it's perhaps not what really drives us to take these trips. It's more the destinations, the places we go, the people we visit. So this photo is taken off the coast of Georgia, sailing offshore, where there are relatively few obstacles. Navigation is relatively straightforward. And under these conditions, it's gorgeous. Here we're in Long Island Sound, which is a combination of being fairly open water, but also protected from the main ocean swells, so a little bit calmer waters. And we had a terrific sail down from Fisher's Island off Connecticut all the way down to near Manhattan. And this was just late one evening as the sun's finally going down. We had a couple more hours until we got to our harbor. But conditions like that are just delightful. A lot of what we did in both the first year and this past trip was working our way through the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway, the ICW. And this is down in the lowlands. I think it's down in South Carolina. And there the navigation is much more precise. You have to be very careful where you're going. It can look quite open in terms of the water, but often the channels are very narrow, it's shallow, and it's very easy to run aground. Although the consequences aren't usually that too dramatic. But it can also be really beautiful. And then there's nighttime. And that's where it gets to be more difficult, particularly if it's just the two of us. We have to have somebody on watch 24/7, and it just gets to be really tiring. It can also be cold, depending on what time of year it is, but very magical. This photo is lit up by the moon, so that's the moon that's creating the light that you see there. I took the shot on a tripod, and the exposures are very long, sometimes up to 3 minutes exposure to get these photos. And you can see the red light that we use down below if we want to preserve our night vision. Oops, go back one. And again, here we're offshore, and you can see Gloria huddled in her foul weather gear. We're always strapped in the cockpit at night, wear life jackets. And we have an autopilot. The boat steers itself, essentially. We have electronic navigation, radar, but somebody needs to keep a watch out for that. And it can be tiring. And in this photo, you can see Gloria's taking a rest on the bench in the cockpit. Often one of us will go down below. We work on a 2-hour on, 2-hour off schedule during the night. But you can also see in the top right the lights from a passing ship. So this is off the coast of South Carolina, and there are freighters and passenger vessels and fishing vessels. So somebody has to keep a watch out. But there is an expression, if you snooze, you lose. So there's the unexpected. Does anyone know what that is? So I saw this in the early hours of the morning, 23rd of April, 2021. And that's the SpaceX rocket taking 4 astronauts up to the International Space Station. I did not expect it, and I had no idea. It took me a few moments to work out what it was, and followed it for several minutes as it flew off into the distance. So that was a wild experience to be out there and to see that, and one we didn't expect. And then that was the morning. So when you're at night on the boat, you really look forward to the sun coming up and the warmth and being able to see things, and that's, you get sunrises like you can't imagine. So what's it like living on the boat? Well, I would say it's cozy, but not cramped. It perhaps looks a little bigger in the photo than it is in reality, but you don't feel like you're too trapped when we're on the boat. In this picture, you can see this is our fruit sling where we hang our fresh fruit. But we have a galley area. There's a navigation area with all the electrics, control panels, a main cabin, and then a V-berth where Gloria and I sleep, and we have a second cabin in the back. So we don't tend to feel too trapped on the boat. It's a nice, cozy place to be. Gloria loves to sew, and quilting is her big thing. And we do have a machine on the boat, and you do get to do some sewing, but it's not as easy or straightforward as working at home when you have all your studio set up. And so that's a compromise. That's why we spend some time at home and sometimes on the boat. We always eat well, because that's a favorite hobby of ours. So up in Maine, fresh lobsters. These ones went in to make lobster scampi. But we do have a 3-burner stove with an oven. We have a fridge, a freezer, hot and cold running water. It's not too primitive on the boat. Although in going through the cupboards, you do have to usually take a lot of stuff out to get to the bottom and then put it all back every time you want to do everything. So storage is challenging. And then we're not trapped on the boat either. So we have a small dinghy, an inflatable with an outboard, and that's our runaround. Jeff asked the question this morning, what's your favorite form of transport? Well, this is our way of getting around when we're on the boat. And here Gloria's in the dinghy, and we're traveling around the Waccamaw River in South Carolina. So that allows us to get off and on the boat a lot. And here, Thoroughfare Creek in the Waccamaw River, and I've rowed over from the boat because it was dead calm and it wasn't very far, but you can see we get to anchor in some beautiful places, and we get to go ashore and get to visit places that you would not otherwise be able to get to where you're not on a boat. The other thing is that we get to see more of the day than we do when we're living at home. So we're on the boat, it's a few seconds to stick your head up and look outside, or we can have coffee up in the cockpit in the morning. So you get to see a lot of sunrises and a lot of sunsets. And this is the light off Duxbury in Massachusetts. We're heading out of the harbor before sunrise. So we probably don't see too many sunrises when we're at home, and we certainly wouldn't be able to be in a position to see this lighthouse if we weren't on a boat. And here we're anchored in the Alligator River, which is in North Carolina, and working our way down the Intercoastal Waterway, and just a very tranquil, beautiful place to be for the evening. We'd had a long day coming down from Coinjock Marina on our way down from Norfolk. And that's in the Sassafras River in Chesapeake Bay. So again, lots of sunrises, lots of sunsets. Wherever you are, you're right there amongst it. And we get to see a lot more weather, both good and bad weather. So this is taken in East Greenwich Bay, our home port down in Rhode Island, and it was late in the summer of 2020, and this was Hurricane Isaias that came up the coast. And we decided to stay on the boat on the mooring, and it wasn't too bad. There was quite heavy wind and quite strong rain as well, but just for a few hours. Our dinghy was airborne off the back of the boat, so we took the engine off, but we kept the dinghy in the water on a rope, and it was literally flying like a kite, flipped over a couple of times. Exciting times. And we get to see, some impressive clouds and squalls. This was up in Maine, and it's a squall line, and it did rain a short time after this photo was taken, and some high winds, but not too bad. And we were anchored at the time, so always try and be, securely anchored. We're very conscious of that when we stop. Make sure that we prepare not just for the weather that we've got at that time, but for what might come. Yes, please.
Where was that?
That is in Penobscot Bay, let's say 10 or 15 miles north of Rockland, and I forget what the island is. It's north of Vinyl Haven.
Okay. Islesboro?
It's somewhere up around there. I'm not remembering, to be honest, what the exact places.
Can I ask when it was?
Yeah, it was in August of 2020. Is that right, Gloria? Yeah. Yeah.
We were on a sailboat up at the far end of that cloud.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah. You'll have to tell me about it afterwards. This one was not so bad. This one was a little worse. We had left St. Catherine's Island and we're heading across St. Catherine's Sound down in Georgia, and the forecast was good. When we looked out at this, it looked like the end of the world. I went below to try and see if I could identify any anchorages that we could duck into to get out of the way of this. And when I came back up, I saw Gloria at the helm with the darkest sky I think I've ever seen in my life. I wanted to get my camera and then thought better of it, given that I was hoping to remain married to Gloria. And the wind picked up to 35 knots almost instantly. But it only lasted 15 minutes and then it was gone. So that was fortunate, and the boat was fine, perfectly stable and great. And then there's fog. If you've been up in Maine, and this is anchored in Rockland Harbour, which we used a lot. It was a good point of entry, but you can't see the junction between the sea and the sky at this point. And even with navigational electronics, it doesn't help you spot lobster pots, of which there are 3 million on the coast of Maine, and they can get wrapped around your propeller, around your rudder, and it can be very challenging. This is anchored off Jewel Island up in Maine, again foggy. When we arrived, it was so socked in that we were relying entirely on our navigational electronics, our chart plotter, radar. We could see the land on the radar and the chart plotter. We could see other vessels. We could hear the surf crashing on the beach, but we couldn't see anything. We were dropped to the anchor, essentially blind, but got a good spot. And then later in the evening, it cleared up just a little bit. You could start to see. And maybe that gives you a sense of the atmosphere in the fog. This picture doesn't really capture it, but we had a couple of rough passages. The worst was sailing south from York, New Hampshire, down past Cape Ann and into Gloucester Harbour. The first 2 hours of that were probably the roughest sailing that we've ever done. And it was hard just to stay standing and to steer the boat. And we were constrained by the Isle of Shoals, by Cape Ann. It was a difficult couple of hours. And once round Cape Ann, things got a lot better. This was on our passage from New York City down to the Delaware River, Delaware Bay. And it started off great, and then the wind went round to the southwest, and from about, let's say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 2 o'clock the following morning, we were pounding our way directly into 15, 20 knots of wind, and it was really brutal. There weren't too many places that we could cut out. This would have been one of them. This is Atlantic City, seen from the ocean. But the forecast for the following days was even worse, and so we just kept going with the hope of getting through. And we did, but it wasn't a pleasant passage. We also get to see a lot more nature, which is really nice. So I'll just show you a few nature shots. This is obviously an osprey. It was checking us out as we were driving around on our dinghy. And then up in Maine, we got to see some loons really close, just sitting in the cockpit of the boat. This is a great egret that was posing, I think, by the hull of another vessel. That's where the blue comes from. And then on shore on Key Biscayne, we came across some raccoons that were actually quite friendly. I suspect they'd been fed, as opposed to being rabid, which would be a concern. And the further south, the more lizards you get. So this is just a lizard that was on a chain link fence, I think down in Key West. But we do really enjoy seeing, a lot of animals and plants as well. So this is a hibiscus, and that became one of my photographic projects over the year. I took a whole set of hibiscus photos, which we do on land. So there's a lot of great opportunities. As a photographer, it's a really nice time for me to be able to spend so much time, taking photos. And then there's the other sorts of animals which are less present. I don't know what these are called. I don't know if Gloria remembers. They're not mosquitoes. They look like mosquitoes. There were hundreds of them over our boat. And unfortunately, they leave these nasty little green poops all over the gel coat of the boat. This was in Chesapeake Bay. And
How big are they?
I would say like size of my little fingernail, something like that. A quarter-inch long. Yeah, they're not very big. Yeah. That's really close up with a macro lens. But they actually do make a mess, believe it or not. They don't bite, which is good. And we do have insect screens on our boat as well in all the hatches. So if we're in buggy places, we can settle down below. So then there's the people aspect. So we get to spend a lot of time together, and that's great. And I think we were incredibly lucky during the COVID year to be together and to isolate together and not to be as alone as many people were. So it's always nice to spend time together. The photograph was taken by a guy called Will Watkins, so we had some friends come visit us. Generally people that we trusted were being careful, to avoid getting infected, and they would come and stay for a week or something like that, and then we'd isolate together. And we're sitting there. That's on a passage from Block Island down to Fisher's Island, I think, was that day. What time of year? So this would have been right at the beginning of October. Yeah.
Because you've got a lot of foul weather gear.
It was a wet and windy day.
Yeah. But you got no shoes on.
Yep, that's right. It was relatively warm. It wasn't. I do have full sea boots and woolly socks and more layers than you can believe. And we had family visit as well. So this is Gloria and her sister Liz, checking out some details of the chart plotter. Gloria's brother Rod also joins us regularly on the boat and came a couple of times to help us with various aspects. And then we spent some time later in the trip down in Key West, and our daughter Natasha, who's on the right-hand side, and her partner Matt came down and visited us for a week. They were going to stay on the boat, but because of COVID, they stayed in an Airbnb to provide some isolation. They were worried about passing it on to us if they flew down and were infected, etc. And the reality was that on the way back, Mac ended up getting COVID and being quite sick and having to isolate after that. Probably the biggest difference on this trip from previous ones was the interactions with other sailors. Typically, sailors will make friends quickly and invite people over for drinks and vice versa, because you're sharing the same experience, and it's just a very friendly thing to do. But in the COVID year, there was much less of that. We didn't invite people on board too much, and vice versa. So that felt very different, and in some ways it did feel more isolated on the boat than it had done in previous years. But we met some great people on the way. This is Glenn. This was down in Marathon in the Florida Keys, and he helped us untangle 2 anchor chains. We'd put out 2 anchors, spun around for a few days, and ended up in an enormous knot. And he was very helpful, and he was a lovely guy. But we didn't really get to know him as well as we might have done on previous trips. The guy on the right is Keith and his son Eli. We met them down in Georgia, and Keith was a furloughed airline pilot. We actually met a couple of airline pilots who were not working because of the pandemic, and he and his son were making a trip in a small boat up the Intracoastal Waterway. We got to chat with them, wander around on shore, but again, we didn't invite them over to our boat or vice versa. We generally tried to keep ourselves separate. And then I should give a thanks to this guy, Larry. This was on our way back. We stopped in Florida. We borrowed a car off Gloria's brother and went out to do some birding. And Larry took us on a 2-hour nature tour on his fishing boat, just impromptu, just met us at the dock and took us out. And what a lovely guy. He and his wife were supposed to come over for breakfast the following morning, but they had to make steps to get back to Alabama, where they'd come from. But we did meet some lovely people, just not as much as previous years. So for the latter part of the talk, I'll just try and touch on some of the memorable places that we went to. And I use the word deliberately rather than saying favorite places, because at least one of them wasn't a favorite place. But this is up in Maine, which is just gorgeous. It's a lovely place. This is in an anchorage off Muscle Ridge Channel, which I think is a lovely name. And it's just so peaceful. Get to see some great views. It's isolated. You get to go ashore to islands that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get to. And this is the same location. You can see our boat is up on the top right, and the other catamaran that was in the anchorage on the left. And a black and white shot in this case. And at the same place again, we woke in the morning. It was foggy. But beautiful, and the fog all burned off. We were able to sit in the cockpit, drink some coffee, have our breakfast, and bald eagle flew right overhead, like 10 foot above the boat. And another location we went to arrived in the fog, and then it cleared up. This is an anchorage called Hell's Half Acre, which I think is a wonderful name. And it was a beautiful place to stay. We spent some time up in Acadia. This is off Southwest Harbor, somewhere a little north of Southwest Harbor. And there's some fantastic sailing. We watched the other boats sailing around. And then we made our way up Somes Sound, which is a fjord in the middle of the island. And spent a few days anchored up there. It's very peaceful, tranquil. And this was just another boat, and the guy had gone ashore, and his dog was waiting for him in the dinghy, so sort of like the shot. This is in it's called Mosquito Harbor, which wasn't true to the name. It was very, no mozzies from what I can remember, and beautiful sunset taken from the island. So I would go ashore, and then I could use a tripod on firm ground to shoot these shots. It's just south of Stonington, Maine.
I thought so.
Yeah.
I know that view.
Yeah, it's a fantastic area. And that's taken in the opposite direction at more or less the same time, and that's the moon coming up, from the other side. So Maine is really a fabulous place to cruise. The only downside are the lobster pots. Perhaps the strangest place or most unusual place we went to is a place called Kiptopeki, which is in the southeast side of Chesapeake Bay. And what they did many years ago was sunk a set of World War II Liberty ships in a line to create a barrier and form a harbor behind them. So are these big concrete ships, which are now sort of degrading, rotting in the ocean, but provide a harbour. And from within that, you get some protection from the bay and from the weather. And it's an interesting place. And it's also very lovely ashore. So that was a nice place to visit. We spent quite a lot of time in the lowlands in South Carolina and Georgia. On the way south, we spent more time in South Carolina and then went offshore around Georgia. And on the way north, we did the reverse. We went offshore we went through Georgia and then offshore up past South Carolina. This is a Wendor Creek near McClellanville, and a ship called Bee's Knees that we had some interactions with, but just a beautiful, peaceful place to spend the night. Some of the islands in Georgia are great to visit. So I think this is St. Catherine's Island. You get these tree skeletons where the ocean has eaten away at the shore and the trees have died and leave spectacular views. That was probably the buggiest moment of my entire life. I did have a bug net on, but it was just covered in midges and mosquitoes, but worth it. And then one of our absolute favorite places was Cumberland Island, which is actually a national park now, or national seashore. And you can go ashore and you can walk for miles on trails through live oaks and Spanish moss. And just great tree sculptures. A very wild and beautiful place to be. And it's also known for its wild horses. So these are feral horses that originate from when, forget the story, but some of the rich landowners, when they gave up their property, they insisted that the horses that were there be allowed to roam wild. And so these have been around now for several generations, and they're beautiful to see. We did have a little bit of a run-in, standoff trying to get to the beach. As I recall, we retreated to our side of the boardwalk, and I think the horse did the same. So in the end, we did walk across. But that was certainly one of the highlights of the trip. Then we went further south, and this is anchored off Fisher's Island in Miami, or Miami Beach. Fantastic views of the sun going down over the Atlantic, and similarly views back, which I'll show in a minute, towards the city of Miami. This was a remarkable place for the party boats that came in, and if you see 20 people on a small boat and you're thinking of distancing through COVID, that was not what it was like in parts of Florida. That's the view from that same anchorage back towards Miami itself. So spectacular lighting, great photo opportunities. We left that anchorage and we went into the lagoon more in front of Miami City and were able to anchor there. And that was our least favorite place. Actually, on any of the trips we've been, I don't think I've been anywhere where it was less welcoming in terms of being a cruiser. Looked quite nice, but you couldn't get ashore anywhere. There was one place you could land the dinghy and go off to the supermarket, but you could only stay 20 minutes. And so that's the one place we felt really trapped on the boat. We did take the dinghy up some of the little canals, and actually if you climbed up onto where the jerry cans are, you could walk up to the street, and we visited the local gas station to fill up our diesel jerry cans. So that was one of our trips ashore, but it wasn't exactly exploring the local area. And at this point, basically by the time we got to Florida, we decided that our plans to go over to the Bahamas and the Caribbean really weren't going to pan out. There's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, we were, from a selfish point of view, worried about catching COVID ourselves and being somewhere where the medical facilities might not be as advanced as here. We were worried that from a selfless point of view, we might be putting pressure on those medical facilities that they didn't need. And from a purely practical point of view, we had no idea what the regulations would be to either get access to the country or depart the country. We heard stories of cruisers that arrived and were refused entry, or were forced to stay on their boats for 12 days or 10 days before they could come ashore. We heard stories of cruisers being asked to leave the country when maybe the weather conditions weren't ideal. So there was just far too much uncertainty. We had traveled to the Caribbean in 2017-18 and gone in and out of 12 different countries. And to think about what the COVID regulations might have been for all those countries and to have those regulations change on an almost daily basis just seemed too much to contemplate. So we changed our plans and decided to stay in the US, and we did a smart thing. We booked a dock in Key West for a month. And that was partly because our daughter wanted to come down and visit, and we wanted to be somewhere warm where they could do it. So we got this great dock, and it was terrific because we were isolated on our boat. We were still unvaccinated at that point. We were right in the middle of Key West, which was an interesting place to visit, but didn't feel that we were greatly at risk. So that worked out really well. And the bit of wood you see is our gangplank for getting on and off the dock. It was a Mediterranean-style mooring, which we had to back the boat into the slip, which didn't always go that well, but that's another story. As I say, we were right down there in the middle of Key West Harbour, and it was really a fun place to be. While there were some activities still going on, sunset cruises, etc., there were no cruise liners coming into Key West, so it was a perfect time to visit. The town was relatively quiet, and it was fun, really, really great. Warm enough that there were outdoor restaurants. You could sit and eat outside if you wanted to, which we didn't do a great deal, to be honest, but you could do that if you wanted to. And this is the pier. I think it's the Edward B. Knight Pier on the south side of the Key West town. And it's empty. There were hardly any people relative to what it normally would be. And that's just the view across the ocean one evening. And I like Key West because it's such a colourful place. We just spent days wandering around, looking at the buildings, beautiful painted buildings, lots of beautiful flowers. And there was a terrific butterfly house. So this was probably not the safest thing to do because it was an enclosed area, but we went in with masks and we actually went back a couple of times. But wonderful butterfly house full of butterflies and tropical birds, and a photographer's dream place. So we had a great time there. And that's Hemingway's house, which we got to walk around. We didn't feel very comfortable walking around inside with the tour group, so we just went round on our own and tried to keep ourselves as much as possible to ourselves. And then when our daughter and her friend came down, we actually got to do some other things like paddleboarding and canoeing through the mangroves. And then got to take them out on a day trip to Boca Grande, which is just to the west of Key West, and you can see it's a beautiful anchorage. We went ashore and just had a lovely time. And then perhaps our number one favorite destination, and the last place that I'll talk about, was down in the Dry Tortugas. And this is the fort that you see from the ocean as you arrive. And it's there because it's a series of sandbanks that creates a sort of natural harbor. So they built a fort here, and now it's a national park and a wonderful place to visit. So we spent a week down there, and we were anchored in the harbor just on the right of this old derelict pier. There's three ways you can get to the Dry Tortugas. You can either go on your own boat, you can take the high-speed ferry from Key West, which while we were there was broken for 4 days. So there were no people coming down, which was sort of nice. Or you can fly in with a plane. And so the planes would arrive in the morning, 2 or 3 planes, back into the beach, drop their passengers, and then fly off after lunch. So in the middle of the day, there might have been a few people walking around the fort, but most of the time it was really quiet.
Is there a landing strip there?
No, they just land on the water.
It has to be a seaplane.
It's a seaplane, and they land right next to your boat. It's funny, they sort of sail right up.
So how did you get that particular picture? Did you put it on first or something and take 10 shots, or?
I don't honestly remember, Jeff, to be honest, but fairly high speed and following it in, and they literally landed right next to our boat. I think I shot that from our boat. It's a magical place to be. It's right out there in the ocean. You've just got sea and sky. The fort itself is interesting to visit. And this was taken from the ramparts at the top of the fort. It's 2 or 3 stories high, and there are no barriers. You could easily walk off the top of the edge if you weren't being careful, which is surprising, I think, for a national park. But I thought it was great, just open access. And we were anchored on the right. We did see one boat come in and anchor here as well at one point. And as I say, the fort itself is interesting to walk around. But the magical sense of isolation is terrific. This was taken from the top of the fort at night, looking out over the ocean, and that's lit by the moonlight. Other vessels in their anchorage were there. And this is just a picture of a boat anchored in the moonlight. So I want to tell you a story about while we were there. So one evening, we had finished dinner. I think we'd sat around reading. It was dark. We were ready to go to bed. And I heard a noise and went up into the cockpit. I could hear some shouting. And at first I thought it was maybe a couple having a little bit of a marital domestic argument or something. But as I listened more clearly, I could hear somebody was shouting for help. And it was at one of those times when a cold front had gone through and it was quite rough. We had pulled the engine off our dinghy. And so I got on the radio and called on Channel 16, the emergency channel, to the National Park Service, and they eventually picked up. But other vessels in the anchorage heard as well, and they had dinghies ready. And so they sent a dinghy out, and a gentleman was solo sailing on a 55-foot sailing yacht. He had tried to get down into his dinghy. He'd hurt his back and had fallen in the water. He spent 45 minutes in the water before he was able to get himself out into his dinghy, but he could not get out into his main boat, and that's why he was calling for help. The people that went over managed to look after him. The Park Service eventually went out as well. They took him back to shore at the fort, and then they flew a helicopter in and took him out to Key West. So I know this for a fact because a couple of months later we were on the dock in South Carolina and we met this guy and got chatting to him. He said, "Oh, where have you been?" As you do. And he said, he was down in the Dry Tortugas as well, and we asked when, and he said, "Oh, do you remember that guy going in the water?" And I said, "Oh yeah, we were the ones who called on the radio." He said, "Well, that was me." so that was the gentleman. So it's a small world. But it's really scary because it's so open there. If he had not been able to get into his dinghy, or his dinghy had been swept away, there's nothing around there. There's no land to have stopped him or anything. So the other thing that the Dry Tortugas is known for is its birds. If you're interested in birding, there are thousands of birds there on the island. A lot of migrants stop in at the fort if there's bad weather, but there are lots of nesting birds as well. So particularly brown noddies, which nest there, and sooty terns. And the Dry Tortugas, I think, are the only place in the US that you can see these two types of birds. And they make a lot of noise, and there are thousands of them, and frigate birds flying overhead, and just gorgeous. So this was our final sunset down in the Dry Tortugas. And from there, it was time for us to start making our way back. So we continued back up the coast and retraced our steps, but stopped in different places on the way back. So at the end of the day, we had a fantastic time, our year afloat. It was different from the previous years that we've been, but we think we were really lucky to be able to have done that. And the impacts that COVID had on us were relatively minor. We ended up getting vaccinated in Florida. That worked out much better than you might have expected. And we felt a lot more relaxed coming back than we did going down. And I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and try and answer any questions you have. And this is the link to our blog, which we do write regularly every day when we're on our sailing trip. So you'll find not 10 years, entries going back 10 years. They're all up there if you're interested, with lots of photos and explore our adventures. So thank you very much for listening.
How far north have you gone with the Maine?
In this current boat, a little further than Bar Harbor, we had a small boat before this, like a 16-foot day sailor, and we went all the way up to Lubeck and the Canadian border in that boat. But that's as far as we've been. It would be nice to go up to Canada and Nova Scotia. And, yeah.
When you are traveling down the coast,
Yeah.
I mean, you have to get provisions.
Yeah.
Are there always grocery stores within
Yeah.
walking distance?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, we can always get to shore. Somebody asked us about Skipper Bob, and there's a booklet called Skipper Bob, which has these ratings for anchorages, and it gives you all sorts of, is it well protected? What's the holding like? Is it beautiful? But also it talks about shopping. Can you get to grocery stores and stuff? So yeah, we would go places where we could go ashore and either walk to grocery stores. We also have folding bikes and take those, or we could get a taxi if need be. We actually got a lift off a couple of people who would stop and pick us up. But yeah, you have to work at it a little bit to carry that. Yeah.
So how big is your boat?
It's 46 foot, our boat.
46.
Yeah.
And how many sails?
So it's got the mainsail. Did you say sails?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's got the mainsail and the Genoa, which are the two that we use regularly. Then there's a staysail, which is on a removable inner forestay. So it's a wire that clips on that can be taken off. And we also have like a spinnaker, a jenica, and we have a set of storm sails as well that we've actually never used. So there's quite a collection of sails on board, but mostly we just use that mainsail and the Genoa. Yeah. So yeah.
When you went, when you went for a year, did you leave in like October and go south and then go to Maine afterwards? What sort of?
Yeah. I think on all the times we've done it, we've gone up to Maine earlier. So in the summer, maybe as early as May or June, and it could be cold going up at that time. But yeah, we've been up in Maine in the summer. September's lovely up in Maine, and then timed our journey south so that we're not too far south before the hurricane season, and also to comply with whatever regulations our insurance companies dictate. The original year, you couldn't go past the Georgia-Florida border before the 1st of December. This most recent trip, you couldn't go south of Norfolk before the 1st of November. So that's sort of how it works. Yes. Yep. So the concern is about hurricanes and not being too far south before the end of the hurricane season. We were on our boat in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy came through. We were down in North Carolina then, so we have been south before hurricanes have really been out. But yeah, you just have to watch out, basically. But that's why. That's what they're worried about. Yeah, please.
How did you end up naming your boat after a bird?
Well, it's great that you know it, but we are both into birding, and the original name of the boat was Diva, and Gloria didn't like that name too much. And we had to come up with something pretty quickly, so we came up with this bird's name. It turns out there was a U.S. minesweeper, I think, in 1945 that was also called Cotinga, but yeah, we're into birds. Yeah.
So when you traveled south, my brother and sister-in-law went down the intercoastal, and they were always worried about getting to a mooring in time, the evening.
Yeah.
Did you ever have that issue?
So it is a concern in that I don't think it would be ideal to be traveling at night in the intracoastal waterway because the navigation is so intricate, it would be difficult. So we didn't travel at night and always tried to be somewhere where we could either pick up a mooring or drop anchor or whatever. But I don't recall ever running out of time and being tight to get to somewhere.
No, I think we tried to figure out, before we would depart, what we were aiming for. And maybe one spot
Yeah.
shorter if, in case the conditions didn't allow us to get away from it. I think we always had a plan.
Yeah. I guess one thing is in the Intracoastal Waterway, we're often motoring or motor sailing rather than pure sailing, and therefore the speed that we're making is more predictable, so you can plan better where you're going to be. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So I'm thinking about that picture that you had, and I don't know how many nights you do this, where you're maintaining watch at night, 2 hours on, 2 hours off.
Yeah.
How many days can you do that? Isn't the next day a little blurry?
So yeah. So Gloria and I have done up to 3 days, day and night, just the two of us. And then with help from others, particularly Gloria's brothers joined us. We've done a couple of other 2-3 day trips back from the Bahamas, stuff like that. And then going over to the Caribbean, that was 10 days, 10 and a half days. But there were 4 of us then. So we did 2 hours on, 2 hours supporting the person who was on, meaning you were sitting in the cockpit, keeping them company if they needed help or whatever, and then 4 hours off. And so that was a more relaxing schedule, but it is really tiring.
Yeah, because 4 hours you get to sleep. 2
Yes.
hours
It's and you could argue, and it might be better that if we did 4 hours on, 4 hours off, just the two of us, it's just a long time on your own during the night. So you're absolutely right. It's a real challenge with just two, and I think it is tiring. Yeah. 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 Yes, please.
What percentage of the miles that you traveled were under sail?
Yeah, that's a. I think we estimate that we probably, on trips like this, we probably spend maybe a third of the time or 40% of the time sailing, 30% of the time motor sailing, meaning that we've got the sail up, but we're also using the engine, and then 30% of the time motoring. And it's because if you're on those inshore waters, it's tough to sail. Offshore, we'd always like to be sailing if we can, and we only use the motor then either to charge the batteries, but also if we're just not making enough progress, then yeah, we're lazy, we switch the engine on. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you.